Far out in the edge of the drift sector where suns burn cold and silence rules space, Cal guided his small rust-colored vessel through empty lanes. Hunting for wreckage and discarded cargo, his systems picked up a distress signal, faint and broken. But still repeating, it came from a derelict transport-class freighter tagged as Mercy. Wind which was drifting without propulsion or signal response. Curiosity mixed with caution. Cal approached slowly while scanning for life signs. No replies came. Back just that pulsing SOS as if someone had triggered it and vanished. He docked carefully, running a bypass on the outer lock while whispering to himself about how stupid this probably was. The outer hull bore recent burn marks, and the blast doors looked warped from inside pressure. Someone had forced their way through or out. His instincts flared, but so did his sense of duty. He had seen enough slaver traps before, and knew this felt off. Inside, the corridors were dark and smelled like scorched coolant. His boots echoed on metal floors as he made his way deeper past cargo crates, some of which were sealed, others cracked and empty. Something had gone wrong here. He held his pulse rifle low, steady eyes scanning ahead until a flicker of motion made him stop. Voices he heard them low, speaking a language he didn't understand, but tones of command and frustration were universal. Moving swiftly, he ducked behind a crate just as two smugglers walked past, both armed, both clearly not part of the original crew. Cal stayed still, watched them disappear down another hall, and then slipped toward the bridge. The door controls were smashed, but he forced his way in, and what he saw made him freeze for a second. The bridge was covered in blood. Not human, though a strange dark fluid stained the walls and controls, and in the command chair lay what was once the captain, an alien species Cal didn't recognize but clearly dead. He checked logs, what was left of them. It seemed the crew had been overwhelmed, taken over mid-route cargo. Redirected smugglers had turned the ship into a prison. He tapped into internal cams. Most were disabled, but one still worked. It showed a cargo bay dimly lit, filled with rows of holding pods, each one glowing faintly, and inside each one was a different alien figure, unmoving but alive. Anger burned inside him, but he pushed it down. He wasn't here to start a war, but he wasn't going to walk away either. He moved fast back through the corridors toward the engine room. The smugglers had left guards there, two of them who didn't expect a human to come sliding in. From a ceiling vent, one dropped before he turned. The other tried to run, but Cal dropped him with a stun blast. With the core under his control, he triggered the emergency lockdown and sealed every bulkhead. The smugglers were trapped, scattered, and without command. It took another hour of careful, silent movement before Cal had them all down, not dead, just unconscious or restrained. Then came the real problem. He stood at the edge of Cargo Bay 4, staring through reinforced glass at the figures inside the holding pods. They were waking up, slowly, disoriented, frightened eyes blinking in confusion. Their skin colors and body shapes ranged from smooth silver-scaled beings to soft-furred quadrupeds to tall figures with glowing eyes. None of them looked dangerous in that moment. They looked lost. Cal entered the override code he had pulled from the bridge, and one by one the pods hissed open. Gases released, restraints unclipped, and the aliens dropped gently to the floor. Kept his hands open, empty, no weapons. No sudden moves. One of the smaller beings staggered forward and stared up at him. It had 4 fingers and no mouth. Only a soft hum from its throat. Then it reached out and touched his hand. He let it. Others watched him with suspicion or fear, but slowly they began to rise, began to stretch their limbs, speak in hushed tones, comfort each other. One of them, an elder with moss-like skin and heavy eyes, stepped forward and bowed slightly. Cal didn't know what to do, so he just nodded and said, "You free." They didn't understand the words, but they felt the meaning. The next few hours were chaos-controlled only by Cal's steady effort to maintain peace. He moved supplies into the bay, brought food and water, unlocked clean quarters, and used translation software to establish basic phrases. The aliens still didn't know if he was truly friend or captor, but he gave them space and never once used force. Later, when he sat alone on the bridge, staring at the starfield ahead, he realized what he had done. He had stopped the smugglers. That was good, that felt right. But now he had a ship full of former slaves. A vessel not registered in his name, limited supplies, and no easy way to explain this to any authority. He was not a hero, not a soldier, not part of any resistance. He was just a human scavenger who followed a distress signal and did what he thought was right. Now he was responsible for dozens of lives from a dozen worlds, each one looking to him for what came next. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, staring at the reflection of his own tired eyes in the bridge glass, while he muttered, "Guess I'm the captain now." And somewhere down in the lower decks, one of the aliens began to sing a slow, soft tune in a voice like wind through hollow stone, as if mourning something lost, or maybe welcoming something new. The ship drifted quietly through space, but inside it something had changed. Something small and human and strange had begun to take root in the silence between stars inside the massive freighter. Now drifting between forgotten lanes of stars, Cal moved from corridor to corridor, checking systems and keeping an eye on the ones he had rescued. They were waking up slowly in groups of 2 or 3, sometimes one alone, trembling, confused, and weak. Each one brought a new challenge, a new expression of fear or wonder. Their eyes, unfamiliar shapes, voices, strange tones, all shared one emotion: uncertainty. Ship felt less like a vessel now, and more like a shelter full of broken voices trying to understand freedom. Cal worked without rest, barely eating. He reprogrammed food dispensers to serve neutral rations. He cleared quarters of slaver tech. He adjusted lighting to softer tones. After one of the smaller winged aliens began to panic from bright exposure, in one section a group of reptilian beings had gathered silently. Standing in a circle, heads bowed, Cal stayed at a distance, respecting whatever ritual they performed. But one of them, a younger one with faint blue stripes, walked over to him slowly. It reached up, touched his wrist, and spoke a single word, then repeated it slowly until Cal repeated it back. They nodded in return to their group. He didn't know what the word meant, but it felt like a beginning. Each day more began to emerge from the shock. One morning, Cal found a strange sight near the main observation bay. A large feline-like creature was placing objects in a line: small stones, bits of broken wire, a burnt data chip, and a spoon. It seemed to be arranging them carefully, like a story laid out on the floor. Cal didn't disturb it, he only watched, then walked away, letting it have its silence. Not all were peaceful. Some feared him with good reason. In one section, a group had barricaded themselves inside a cargo hold. They believed him to be another slaver, pretending to be kind until they were weakened again. When Cal tried to speak through the door, they threw objects at the walls, and one of them screamed in a tongue the translator couldn't catch. Later, he returned without weapons, without force, and left water and food just outside the sealed entrance. The door remained closed for 2 more days, then opened slowly, and one figure stepped out, eyes watching him with heavy suspicion. It took time, but slowly even those most wounded began to look at him without trembling. Cal started assigning quarters, marking walls with simple icons to guide movement. He created a common area filled with cushions and light. He left blank data pads there and watched with interest as some of the aliens began to draw symbols or maps of places he didn't recognize. They were remembering, he thought, or maybe rebuilding pieces of identity lost during captivity. One of the young ones started following him around. It had soft green skin and no visible mouth, but it hummed constantly, as if singing to itself. When Cal stopped to fix something, it would crouch beside him, silently observing when he walked. It stayed 3 steps behind. He began to call it real in his head, short and easy the way its movements felt. He never asked them their names. He figured names should be given, not taken. Old Healer emerged from a quiet room one night with careful steps and eyes filled with centuries of sorrow. It came to Cal without fear and placed a hand on his shoulder, then raised its other hand and gently touched Cal's forehead. It was a gesture that carried no violence, only memory. Cal stood still as the alien whispered something that echoed like wind in a canyon. He did not understand it, but something in him softened under its weight. The days passed with slow rhythm, and the ship began to shift. It no longer felt like a graveyard. It became something different. A place of slow healing, of hesitant trust, of quiet conversations in the dark. Cal found himself fixing more than just metal. He spent hours listening through the translator, trying to understand fragments of stories, lost languages, tiny details about home planets, oceans with red skies, trees that sang before storm seasons, beasts that glowed under twin moons. He absorbed it all without judgment, only wonder. Then came the incident that reminded him this was still dangerous. During a quiet cycle, 3 aliens broke into the armory. One of them had once served as a fighter before slavery and still carried scars of command. They took weapons, activated defense systems, and moved toward the bridge. Cal intercepted them alone. There was shouting, confusion. One fired a stun blast that missed. Cal ducked, rolled behind a panel, and called out through the intercom, telling them he wasn't their enemy. He spoke without anger, told them they could shoot if they wanted, but he would not fight back. They hesitated. Then Reel appeared from behind them, humming softly, moving forward slowly, hands open. The 3 stood frozen, then lowered their weapons, as if the sight of one of their own standing unafraid beside a human was more powerful than any shield. Cal removed the weapons gently. No cuffs, no threats, only a promise. He repeated again and again, "You're not prisoners, not anymore." He placed the weapons back into locked storage and erased the idea of control from his actions. Later that cycle, some of the aliens gathered around the central commons, not in fear, but out of choice. They sat or stood in circles, exchanged quiet words. Some began to sing low songs in voices that cracked from misuse. One of the larger beings began carving into a panel using its claws, creating a mural that slowly formed into stars and hands reaching toward each other. Cal stood outside the circle, arms crossed, tired but still alert. He didn't understand their songs. He couldn't feel what they felt, not exactly, but he knew what was happening. Something was being built here, not a crew, not yet, not a family, not yet, maybe not even peace, but something was growing between them all, something alive. And Cal knew that from this point forward he couldn't go back to being a scavenger, just drifting alone through cold space, chasing broken things for credits. He was tied to this ship now, tied to these lives, to the second chance they were all trying to find together. He walked back toward the bridge and sat down, watching the stars outside the glass. This wasn't his ship, not really, and they weren't his responsibility, not exactly, but still he would not leave them. Not now, not ever. The silence of space was no longer comforting. It had changed from calm into tension, a quiet that pressed against the hull, as if holding breath, waiting to break. Cal had been scanning outer lanes for hours, eyes locked on signals that drifted in and out of focus. Something was moving out there, something hunting them. The freighter was large, slow, and still, scarred from its past, its systems old, its shields weak, but it carried life now. It carried purpose, and that made it a target. They had been discovered. Cal had known this day would come. Smugglers never forgot, especially not when profit was taken from their hands and scattered into the void. The ones he had defeated would not forgive him. They would send ships, they would send warnings, and they would make examples. The first sign came in a whisper, a message cracked by encryption, not meant for him, but caught by accident. It spoke of a ghost ship. It spoke of stolen cargo. It spoke of a human who had betrayed trade laws and disappeared with valuable merchandise. Cal shut off the playback and stared at the stars ahead. His jaw clenched, not from fear, but from focus. He gathered the strongest and the most aware of the rescued aliens into the central commons. He stood before them, no podium, no armor, no perfect words, just truth. "We are being followed." Translator repeated it in voices that echoed from different throats and different depths. The room stayed silent for long seconds, then soft murmurs began. One of the winged beings with dark eyes stepped forward and asked a question, its voice trembling, but strong. "What do we do now?" Cal answered simply, "We fight, or we run, or we do both." They looked at each other, slowly, unsure, until the old healer moved into the center and spoke in that strange deep voice again. But this time, others nodded and stepped forward with it. One by one they began to offer help. One knew power systems, One knew shield harmonics, one had once flown patrol crafts, another had mapped escape routes across forbidden sectors. They were no longer afraid, not entirely now. They were ready to protect each other and protect the man who had given them choice. Training began not with shouting or commands, but with movement, rhythm, and memory. Cal walked them through defense panels, through basic repairs, through how to monitor sensors and how to shut down power in emergencies. He showed them how to seal hatches, how to move silently in zero gravity, how to rotate shifts for rest, and how to fire a basic pulse turret without causing overload. Some learned faster than others, some forgot and tried again, some broke into sudden laughter when they succeeded, some wept silently when reminded of their old ships and lost friends. One night, near the edge of a dense asteroid field, they detected the signal. A cruiser larger than theirs, faster and armed, not just with weapons, but with trackers and nets. Slaver design, brutal and efficient. It had found them. It was closing in. Cal made a decision. He rerouted all power to engine backups and swung the freighter toward the densest part of the field. Gravity pulled at the hull. Alarms rang, lights flickered, but the ship held steady, barely. The aliens, now crew, worked together under pressure. Someone rerouted heat flow, someone else recalibrated hull balance in real time. One of the reptilian engineers moved through vent shafts with a torch to adjust melted cables. It was no longer chaos. It was survival built on trust. The enemy ship followed, tried to mirror their path, but lacked patience or respect for the rocks. It clipped a spinning stone and spun off course, slightly buying time. Cal used that time well. He initiated a plan only he had dared to test before. False signal was launched from the back of the freighter, mimicking power loss. It drifted, quietly glowing like bait. The slaver cruiser chased it, thinking it was victory. When the cruiser moved closer, the freighter looped around one of the larger asteroids, hugging its shadow engines cold to avoid detection. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing behind radiation fields and broken rock. Silence returned, but now it held something different, not fear but pride. Later in the commons, Cal walked past a small group gathered around one of the data pads. They were drawing again. This time a figure was sketched in thick charcoal lines. A tall form surrounded by stars behind it. Shapes of wings, claws, crystals, and shadows stood beside it, not beneath it. One of the artists looked up as Cal passed, and without speaking offered the pad to him. He took it, stared at the drawing for a long moment, then gave it back with a small nod. He didn't need to understand every symbol. He felt what it meant. They were not cargo anymore. They were not victims. They were crew now. When night came, or what they called night, he returned to the bridge and stood at the front watching the stars move slowly across. The glass reel was beside him, silent but humming as always. The tune now steady like a quiet engine warming up. The ship had changed. Its name wasn't spoken yet, but it no longer answered to the call of the past. Its core carried voices of dozens of worlds and one human who refused to run alone. They had escaped today, but Cal knew more would come, and when they did, he would be ready. Not just with weapons, but with something stronger, with unity, and with the strange unspoken bond that had grown between him and those he saved. And somewhere in the far dark, a beacon was still pulsing, slow and soft, not of fear, but of warning. The ship is not what it was. It is not yours anymore. It belongs to something new. The stars stretched like thin wires in the black distance, and the ship moved forward, slow but steady, carrying the weight of its new life. Within every wall and corridor, there were signs of change. Faint carvings along the edges of doorframes, soft colors painted by careful hands, symbols from a dozen cultures, now glowing faintly under the dim lights. Cal watched it all without saying much, his steps always quiet as he moved between rooms, checking on power levels, checking on them. They had become something more than passengers, more than rescued souls. They had formed patterns of purpose, rules, shaped not by orders, but by willingness. Someone repaired lights. Someone watched over the younger ones. Someone kept a log in symbols that no one else could read, but that everyone respected. Cal began teaching them more complex things. How to fly through dust storms, how to track pirate signals, how to bluff through border scans using old tricks. He had learned in places no maps ever showed. They listened closely, not with blind obedience, but with interest because they wanted to. Survive, not just float endlessly in fear. Then the warning came. It was not a surprise. Another slaver ship had entered their path. This one not a scout, not a raider, but something heavier, armed with cannons, meant to tear asteroids apart. Shields that pulsed like breathing skin. They had found them again, and this time they were not alone. A second vessel followed, slightly smaller but faster, both coming in with purpose and silence. Cal did not panic. He gathered the crew. This time they met him in the control chamber, not as strangers, not as frightened beings, but as a team standing in shared silence, waiting for his words. He told them the truth. They could run again, but this time escape was less likely. The enemy had learned. They were serious, had come prepared to crush, not to capture. They listened without interrupting. He looked at each of them slowly, his voice calm and steady. We make our stand here, not for glory, not for revenge, but for choice. The translator repeated his words in several tones, some musical, some sharp, some low and deep. The crew did not cheer. They only nodded and walked to their stations. Ship began to move toward a small moon field where magnetic storms twisted navigation systems, where signal echoes confused scanners. Cal had fought near these moons once long ago. He remembered hiding in the magnetic fog and using it to turn larger ships against themselves. Used the same strategy again. The freighter was not fast, not strong, but it had something else. It had minds working together, each one different, each one skilled in a way no slaver system could predict. While the enemy ships advanced with straight lines and brute strength, the freighter slipped through rock fields, laid small traps, scattered metal debris to mimic mines, rerouted heat to confuse sensors. When the first slaver ship fired, Cal dropped power from the engines and let the freighter drift between two moons. The beam missed by inches, smashing into the surface and triggering a wave of static that bounced through nearby systems. The second ship tried to flank them, but flew straight into a cloud of charged gas that scrambled its visual feed inside the freighter. No one panicked. They moved with calm. They adjusted stabilizers. They ran heat checks. They watched each other, not for command, but for trust. Then came the real moment. Enemy fired again, this time striking the outer hull, a blast strong enough to throw everyone sideways. Alarms blared, steam hissed from broken valves. A younger alien screamed and was pulled back by one of the larger ones, who used its own body to shield the child. Cal rose from the floor, blood trickling from his forehead, but his hands moved fast, pressing buttons, rerouting, power shifting. Balance. He saw the readings, knew the damage was bad. If they waited, they would be crushed. If they attacked, they had only one chance. He gave the signal. A small team moved to the secondary engine room, carrying one of the oldest power cores they had salvaged, and rewired it into a launch system, not a weapon by design, but now turned into one. They attached it to the emergency shuttle and aimed it straight at the larger enemy ship. There was no speech, no farewell, only a silent nod from Bren, the large, silent alien who had been among the first to trust. Cal had stepped into the shuttle alone, closed the hatch, and launched before anyone could stop it. The shuttle flew fast, unshielded, powered only by the burning core behind it. The enemy saw it coming, tried to shoot it down, failed at the last moment. Bren directed it with a final correction right into the underbelly of the cruiser, and the impact turned space into flame. The explosion rocked the moons, shattered debris rained like fire. Across the void, the second slaver ship pulled back, confused and damaged. Drifting without guidance, the freighter powered up its engines and moved out of the field, away from the smoke, away from the echo of sacrifice inside the ship. No one spoke. For a long time they gathered in the commons, where the lights were dim and the air carried the weight of silence. Someone began humming a soft tune. Others joined slowly, not as a celebration, but as memory. Cal stood among them, quiet, hands clenched, eyes closed, not to hide pain, but to feel it fully. They had won, but the cost was real. Later he returned to the control chamber and looked at the empty chair beside him where Bren used to rest in silence. He reached down and placed a small object there, a fragment of metal engraved with lines that meant nothing to machines but everything to them. The ship flew onward, stars sliding past like old friends, returning to greet them, but nothing felt the same. Now, not after the stand, not after what they had given to protect what they had become. They were no longer victims, no longer cargo, no longer passengers in someone else's world. They were a crew, and they had earned the right to be. Days after the battle moved slowly like deep tides under quiet stars, the freighter drifted on its own path, wounded but alive, carrying stories in its walls. Stories made not of victories or perfect plans, but of choices made in silence and courage. Born from shared survival, Cal spent most of his time walking through the ship, not as a commander, not as a savior, just as a man who had taken a burden and kept carrying it because it felt right. The crew had changed. They were no longer afraid of him or of the stars outside. They moved with a rhythm, now like the pulse of a single body, different in shapes and voices, but connected by something stronger than fear. They had seen death. They had tasted loss. They had also seen how one life, given without hesitation, could light a fire across every heart. Bren's name was carved into a wall near the commons, not with words, but with symbols of strength drawn from every culture on board. It was not a memorial in the old sense. It was a map showing how courage looked in many forms, how one could live forever, not through breath, but through memory. Cal stood before that wall more than once, each time saying nothing, only placing a hand over the marks, letting the silence speak more clearly than words ever could. A message came weeks later, soft and encoded, drifting through the black with the scent of bureaucratic language and diplomatic coldness. The Planetary Union had heard whispers about a ship full of escaped cargo. They had tracked rumors about a human who had broken slaver codes and vanished into deep space. Now they were reaching out with words wrapped in caution. Amnesty and protection offered to those aboard. Names would not be required, no interrogations, no forced returns, only one choice. A location was marked on the map, a planet near the edge of safe space, a place where refugees were sometimes accepted if they chose to begin again. Cal read the message twice, then closed it without answering. He called a meeting, the first of its kind, not just a gathering for orders or alerts, but something different. The room filled slowly. The crew, now used to moving as one, yet still carrying their differences with pride. Feathers, fur, scales, crystals, each one unique, yet part of this strange whole. He explained the offer simply and without pressure, told them where the planet was, told them what the Union promised, told them that this decision belonged to them, not to him, not to law, not to guilt. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then voices began rising, some hopeful, some hesitant, some speaking of freedom, some speaking of uncertainty. One by one, they shared thoughts, dreams, memories of what they had lost and what they feared to find again. The end, it was not Cal who made the decision. It was all of them together, a slow, quiet agreement formed not through votes, but through eyes meeting across the room, through hands resting on shoulders, through nods given without sound. They would not go to the planet, not yet, maybe not ever. They had already found a home, not a perfect one, not a paradise, but something better, something real. The ship became their world. They renamed it, not in one language, but in many, a name whispered in song, painted on the hull in shifting colors, spoken in signs, drawn in symbols that glowed faintly under passing starlight. Free Wind, the name danced between translations, but always meant the same thing, a vessel that belonged to no one, a home made by hands once chained, now free. Cal took his place at the helm, not as the only voice, not as the great hero, just as one of many guiding the course, using knowledge not for power but for protection. He watched as the ship came alive, walls painted with new patterns, quarters reshaped to suit different needs. A garden started near the engineering bay, using filtered light and old soil pods. Someone began printing books filled with stories. Someone else started a ritual of songs shared before sleep cycles. Every corner of the ship carried a mark of who they had become one day. A young being with eyes like liquid stone came to Cal, holding a drawing, a rough sketch of the ship flying through stars, surrounded by smaller ships, strange and beautiful. The child pointed at them and spoke slowly through the translator. Will we help them too? Cal looked at the drawing for a long time, then smiled, not with pride, but with quiet understanding. He nodded because that question held the future, not just for them, but for everything they might become. The free wind moved forward, no longer hiding, not waiting for permission, not shaped by fear. It flew through systems that had forgotten hope, carrying the echo of a new way, not built on power or trade, but on trust, on survival, on the quiet strength of choosing kindness again and again. Cal stood often by the main window, watching stars pass, watching shadows fade. He no longer felt alone, no longer drifted in search of something lost. Now he belonged not to a place or a mission, but to a family not made by blood, but by choice. And somewhere beyond the nearest nebula, a slaver ship caught the signal of the free wind and chose not to follow. The name now carried weight, not of threat, but of legend, the story of a human who refused to leave the broken behind, who turned prisoners into crew and silence into purpose. The free wind kept flying, not toward a destination, but toward a future not yet written, and every soul aboard it knew they were not cargo, they were not survivors, they were free. The end.